Neuroscience is a really exciting topic right now, and everybody wants to learn about the brain. Okay, maybe you're interested in learning about the brain. Let's start with the lobes. The top, very large, wrinkly part of the human brain is called the cerebrum. That's where all the thinking and processing and sensing and so on goes on. The outer layer of the cerebrum is called the cortex. On the outside, we have what is called gray matter, these cells that do the thinking and computing, calculating, look gray in color. If we looked inside, we would see the white matter. These axons, the fibers that connect the various cells, look white because they are coated with myelin, a white fatty substance. The cerebrum is divided from front to back by what is called the longitudinal fissure, a groove from front to back that divides the cerebrum into a left side and a right side that are called hemispheres. So you have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. The lobes of the brain are different parts or areas of the hemispheres. We have 4 lobes on each side, left hemisphere and right hemisphere. They are called frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. You're going to learn about each of those in this video. There is a deep groove on each hemisphere, left and right, that is called the central fissure or the central sulcus, and in medical school it's called the fissure of Rolando. This divides the front of the brain from the back of the brain, so the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. There is another deep groove on the side of the brain that is called the lateral fissure or lateral sulcus. In medical school, it's called the fissure of Sylvius, and it divides the front lobe from the temporal lobe, which is by your temple, easy way to remember it. So here we see an illustration. The central fissure divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The lateral fissure divides the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. And then way in the back, lower back, we have the occipital lobe. Those are the 4 lobes we're going to learn about in this video. Let's start with the frontal lobe. In the very front of the cerebrum, on both sides, you have a left frontal lobe and a right frontal lobe. And this is the part of the brain that makes us most human. It's the part of the brain that's most different from our nearest animal relatives. The frontal lobe is very involved with body movement. A good lesson is that the front of the brain sends signals out and the back of the brain receives signals coming in. So the front of the brain is sending signals out to the body to move the body around. And then the very front of the frontal lobe, which is called the Pre-Frontal Cortex, is kind of like the boss of the brain, where the higher mental functions are: planning for the future, thinking, choosing, making decisions, and so on. That's prefrontal, the very front of the frontal lobe. At the very back of the frontal lobe, we have what is called the primary motor area. This is the part of the cerebrum that sends signals down to the body and to the muscles in the body. In front of the primary motor cortex in the frontal lobe are the supplementary motor area and the premotor area. These are areas of the brain that help plan motor movements, that is, moving your body around. You also have the frontal eye fields there. And then also in the frontal lobe is Broca's area, which is a language area that helps you speak and helps you use grammar. Behind the frontal lobe is the somatosensory cortex. That's in the parietal lobe. We'll get to that in a minute. So here is the parietal lobe, the upper back part of the cerebrum. This part of the brain receives sensory information coming in from the body. So information about touch and body movements and pain and temperature and balance and so on is coming to this back part. So back of the brain receives information coming in, front of the brain sends information going out. In this illustration, we see the left and right parietal lobes, which are the upper back part of the cerebrum, and the parietal lobes are receiving information from the body, so they're very important in helping to coordinate motor movement by working with the motor cortex in the frontal lobe, and also in helping us to create a sense of who we are, a sense of a feeling of I'm in my body, I'm myself. Signals from the body, touch, pain, temperature, body movement, and so on, are going through nerves in our body up to our brain and sent to the parietal lobe where they are analyzed. So we get those feelings of touch and sensation of pain and so on. The very front of the parietal lobe, the area shown in blue here, is called the somatosensory cortex or somatosensory area. Somat means body, sensory means signals coming in from the body to the brain. So these are body signals like touch, for example. When you stimulate a person in this somatosensory cortex, they feel something. If you have damage in this area, you lose your sense of feeling, you have numbness. Both the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex are organized pretty much upside down relative to the body. So if you're damaged at the top of the somatosensory area, you will have a lack of feeling in the lower part of your body. And similarly, if you're damaged at the top of the motor cortex, you will have paralysis in your foot, for example. The cerebrum is contralateral. The left hemisphere is connected to the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere is connected to the left side of the body. So if you have damage where you see the red X, that would mean a lack of movement of the right foot because we're looking at left hemisphere. The temporal lobes are on the side of your head, about in from your ears. The temporal lobes are important for auditory processing, that is, hearing, analyzing sounds. Also memory on the interior, the inside of the temporal lobe, and also an area for understanding language. This illustration shows the auditory area, which is at the very top of the temporal lobe. And in fact, the primary main auditory cortex is in the inside of the lateral fissure, and then the secondary auditory cortex surrounds it. And the cells there correspond roughly to the keys on a piano. If we look on the inside of the temporal lobe, we find a brain area called the hippocampus and the surrounding area, which altogether is called the hippocampal area, which is very important for holding on to memories and then storing them and later retrieving them. So the interior, what we call the medial temporal lobe, is very important for learning and memory. One more area of the temporal lobe that we'll point out here in this video, at the upper back part of the temporal lobe, is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's, named after a German doctor, that's why it's pronounced Wernicke. This is an area of the brain that's important for language, especially incoming language. So figure out the meaning of language. So for example, when we read, notice that Wernicke's area is near the occipital lobe, the very back of the brain, which we'll get to next, which is all about vision. So when we read, Wernicke's area is close to that. Also, when we hear language, Wernicke's area is close to the auditory area. Wernicke's area is important for understanding language. Next, and finally, the occipital lobes. In the very lower back of the brain, these lobes are extremely important for vision. This is where the visual cortex is. The cells there organize visual information and help us to see. Information from the eyes travels electrical signals, and then chemical signals through various tracts in the brain that eventually end up way in the back in what are called V1 cells, which are the first cells, V standing for vision, the first cells in the occipital lobe that receive that information and give you the feeling that you see something. And then other cells process that information to help you understand what you see. What color is it? What is it? Where is it? The visual signal starts then in the very back in the occipital lobe, but travels forward in the brain. And one signal goes up into the parietal lobe, and another signal goes down into the temporal lobe. These are both visual streams. The one that goes up into the parietal lobe helps you figure out where the thing is that you're looking at. So we sometimes call that the where pathway. And the pathway that goes into the temporal lobe is figuring out what is it, what color is it, what shape is it, and so on, what is its name. So we sometimes call that the what pathway. And here then is an illustration that shows you, reminds you again where these lobes are, the four lobes of the cerebrum, and gives you a little tiny bit of information about what their functions are. So four lobes of the brain: the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Okay, that's the end of our video. I hope you learned a lot about the lobes of the brain, and maybe you're just starting the study of the brain, and this is a really good place to start. And please look at some more of my videos. My name is Professor Bruce Hinrichs. My channel is called Brucey. I have lots of other videos about psychology, and thanks for watching. Bye.